And I also want to thank our presenters for today's webinar, Jeff Hewings and Graham Toft, for the work they've put into this and for the time they've given to us. We're going to jump right into the topic in a couple of minutes, but before we do, I wanted to review a few procedural points so that you know how the webinar will proceed and how things are going to operate with our GoToWebinar technology. Procedurally, we're going to start off with just some introductory remarks about our project and also about this individual webinar, followed by our presentations, first by Jeff Hewings and then by Graham Toft. We expect the presentation portion to take about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll devote the remainder of the time to question and answer and some open discussion. Our presenters will be able to stay on the line for past the hour. We want to try to wrap it up in about an hour, but we're happy to let that discussion continue if folks are interested and able to stay on the line, but of course don't feel obligated to. We understand that this is getting late in the day and that you probably have other things that you want to do, especially those of you in the Eastern Time Zone. We're kind of pushing to the end of your work day, so, but hopefully the discussion will be fruitful throughout. I'm going to review some things about the GoToWebinar technology that should help us with our discussion portion. There is a control box that you should be able to see, and most likely it's displayed in the right-hand portion of your screen. You can hide that box by clicking on the arrow that's on the top left, which is just to the left of a file menu in that little control area. By closing that, it will prevent you from obstructing any part of the PowerPoint during the presentation. And then you can expand that box by clicking the same arrows that will be in the upper right hand of your screen. You will want to expand that during our discussion portion so that if you need to raise your hand for anything or to submit a question in the little dialog box. We are going to hold off addressing any questions or comments until the end of both presentations. And we do want to get as many questions as possible, and the format that we're going to use is primarily we want to use the hand-raising feature. Next to your name there should be a couple little items, one of them which is a hand. So if you have a question, go ahead and click that hand. It'll raise your hand, and then you'll be in queue for a question. And we do want the discussion to be as interactive as possible, so please feel free while we're having the open discussion, and if you have something to add or you can answer some of the questions yourself, feel free to chime in at any time. We do ask that when you ask a question verbally that you please give us your name and your state and the organization that you're with so we can help identify you. Then lastly, a couple of things about the phone. We're going to ask 3 things about kind of phone etiquette. We would like everybody to mute their phone during the presentation portion. This will eliminate some of the background noise if you're typing or other things while we're doing this. And you can do that either by using your individual phone's mute feature if you have one. If you don't have one, you can press *6, and that will mute you through our conference service. And then to unmute your phone, it's the same thing, *6. So anytime *6 to mute, *6 to unmute. The other thing we ask is that you do not use your speaker phone when asking questions or engaging in discussion. Because we are recording this webinar, the audio is somewhat sensitive and doesn't always pick up well when you're on the speaker phone. Again, it's fine to be on speaker when you're just listening, but if you're talking, we ask that you pick up the line to talk. And lastly, please don't put your line on hold. There are some phone systems out there that play some music or beeps when you're on hold, and that'll interrupt our presenters and the discussion. So with those instructions, I'm going to now turn things over to Nebraska Senator Heath Mello. Senator Mello is a member of the MLC Economic Development Committee and has been for a few years now, and he is serving as the chair of the advisory group that oversees this project. He's been very active with our committee, and he's shown a great passion for improving the economic fortunes of both Nebraska and of the Midwest region. And we're very fortunate to have him leading this work for this project, and I'm personally privileged to be able to work with him. He is going to tell you a little bit more about the project first and then introduce today's webinar and today's presenters. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Mello.
Well, thank you, Laura, for the opportunity to participate in today's webinar, and everyone out there. It should be a very informative conversation and dialogue, both with Dr. Hewings as well as Dr. Toft. briefly, I want to provide a little background on kind of the webinar series as well as kind of how this entire project got started a little bit. At the last year's Economic Development Committee, chaired by Representative Celeste from Ohio and Senator Valley from South Dakota, it was the kind of consensus of the committee to look to explore a handful of ideas and a handful of issues in which the Midwest region could look for some common ground in regards to more collaboration in regards to our economic development policies. And really this webinar series has been designed to explore the potential for regional economic development to advance not just one state or another, but to really advance the entire Midwest region. And the focus has been on the national as well as more conversation as well on the international front, which I know Dr. Toff will be able to explain significantly. The goals that we have discussed as a working group a little bit in regards to developing some principles of collaboration. The first one was in how is it that we can create a better understanding of how our region is interconnected and how our region's economies are interconnected from job creation to tax incentives to job attraction, employment, workforce development, a host of areas that we know we are interconnected, and we just need to be able to start, I think, a more frank and honest dialogue about that. And the second one, I would say, goal was how is it that we can encourage our Midwest region to engage in more formalized efforts for regional collaboration. And it's something that the chair of CSG, the MLC, Representative Reske from Indiana, has been a very strong advocate on behalf of trying to encourage that formal process and regional collaboration, and ideally we'll really kick off that process with today's webinar. The webinar series itself will examine collaboration. We've laid it out in two ways. One, an examination of why it's important for us as a region to consider more collaborative efforts, as well as how the region can benefit from each other's policies and working with each other. And the second component really is an examination of 5 areas that were identified at the Economic Development Committee meeting this past summer, as well as focusing on how individual states can advance kind of these growth agendas behind these 5 key areas and what our collaborative effort would look like in these 5 key areas. These 5 areas, beyond today's kind of initial foundational webinar, we have 5 other webinars that we're looking at doing. Today's obviously was looking at creating the Midwestern growth zone. And the next 5 were the 5 key areas that were designed based on kind of the consensus that was developed at the CSG MLC meeting in Toronto. The second one that we're looking at in the week of March 7th is early stage capital building. Then we're going to move on to more of a regional energy policy agenda. After that, we're going to look to education reform and improvement, targeting also higher education and workforce development. Fifth, we're going to look at exports and international trade. That seemed to be an issue that really connects both Canada and the United States, but more importantly, how that ties to our individual states in the region in itself. And then last but not least, an issue that was on the forefront of everyone's mind is how is it we can create a regional identity through better marketing, better branding, more enhanced tourism coordination, and that'll be the last webinar for our series. So with the end result, after we go through these webinars, the end result is Laura, who is our point person, will help us develop and draft kind of a written summary or a written memo, so to speak, after these webinars, and be able to flesh out questions and answers, as well as lay some of the foundational statements that are needed for us to be able to release at the MLC meeting this summer in Indianapolis. And chairs, the Economic Development Committee chairs, Representative Celeste of Ohio and Senator Valley of South Dakota, will lead us through the discussions of our next steps of regional collaboration with MLC Chair Representative Reske, who's also was a member of the committee for a significant amount of time as well, come July when we meet in Indianapolis. So with that serving as the backdrop for today, I want, before we really begin to talk about the ways in which the Midwestern states can collaborate on economic development, it's important that we start the discussion of why we as a region would even want to think about collaboration. And here to talk with us about his research and his perspective of why, based on the evidence of economic interdependencies among the various Midwestern states, regional collaboration makes sense, is Dr. Jeffrey Hewings. Dr. Hewings is director of the Regional Economics Applications Laboratory and interim head of the Department of Economics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His main research areas are in the fields of urban and regional analysis with a strong emphasis on the development and application of large-scale models. His work has also focused on modeling the changes in national and regional economies associated with the development of free trade agreements, something that's very important, I think, to the Midwest conversation. Some of his current work also focuses on interstate trade among states in the Midwest region. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Hewings.
Thank you very much indeed. It's my pleasure to be here. I think the best way for me to summarize my message is that I think we are missing an enormous opportunity by our attention to focus on what divides us, rather what integrates us. And what I hope to show in my presentation is enough evidence that suggests that we need to really change that thinking. So the main idea here is to try to demonstrate to you that we're dealing with a part of the world which is very heavily connected to each other, and that as a result of this connection, our economic fortunes are no longer dependent solely on what happens within each state, but increasingly on what happens across states. So that the goal here is then to provide you with some insights into the nature and the strengths of the interactions that are currently characterizing this Midwest economy. So if we look at the region that we're looking at, we have a very extensive geography for this Midwest. Today, most of my work is going to focus on the states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, but we have extended it to the other regions that I've shown here, the other states, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa. As we think about this region, I think it's important for us to have a sort of couple of benchmarks. And I think the one characteristic is, as we look at the part of the region that is to the east of the Mississippi, we notice that the effects of the recession have been pretty uniform in terms of the fact that they have driven up the unemployment rates way above the national average. And in many cases, several points above the national average, with states like Michigan, now one of the states with the highest unemployment rate in the country. And I think it's important for us to understand that in contrast to prior recessions, the pain of this recession has been pretty uniform in terms of its spread throughout this region. And I think this tells us very much that this region is so integrated that any structural change that takes place in one part is likely to spill over into other parts of the system in a very, very profound and very important way. And I have some information that will provide you with that sort of insight as we look ahead now. Looking at the data in a more dramatic way, one thing that we have noticed with a lot of states in this region is that they never really recovered from the effects of the recession that took place in 2000, 2001. And what I've shown on this graph is essentially the catch-up that would be required just to get us back to where we were over a decade ago. And you can see for the state of Michigan, we would require employment creation of something in the order of 850,000 jobs, for Ohio over 600,000 jobs, for Illinois over 450,000 jobs. And I want to point out that these really are conservative estimates, because in the last 10 years, our population and our workforce has expanded. And furthermore, during the current recession, we have noticed that the labor force participation rates have declined by as much as 2 percentage points in many of these states. And so in many cases, we would need to add a further 10 to 15, in some cases 20% more to these numbers, so that for a state like Michigan, we are probably talking well in excess of 900,000 jobs. In my own state of Illinois, our estimate is that we would need something of the order of 600,000 jobs just to get us back to where we were. So the challenge we face is non-trivial, it is significant, and the implications of this have been very profound across the region, but nowhere more so than in terms of the impact that they have had on state finances and local government finances. So as we look upon this region then in these terms, I think that there are some general characteristics that we can say. Nationally, we have seen enormous changes. Manufacturing now is contributing somewhere around 14 or 15% to our gross national product. We've seen dramatic changes of economic activity first moving from the Midwest to the south and southeast of the U.S. We've had enormous changes in the spatial organization of production, and I'll come back to that somewhat more fully a little later. And in the Midwest, these effects have been much more profound because this was the economic engine, this was the center of manufacturing, and the losses of those manufacturing jobs have been really profound in terms of their impact on the economy. But at the same time this has happened, we have found two very apparently contradictory things happening. At one and the same time, our states are becoming more complementary. Complementary in the sense that they are more dependent upon each other. At the same time, they're also becoming much more competitive. And that competition is coming about from the fact that the production chains that we are seeing evolving in the Midwest are becoming much more integrated. But at the same time, the states are competing to try to capture those components of that value chain. So at one and the same time, our Midwest economy is becoming more complementary. At the same time, it is becoming more competitive. And this then generates this sort of interesting paradox that we need our surrounding states to be effective. We need them to be growing because we're very dependent on them. At the same time, we are competing with them to try to garner as much of the economic activity as we can. So if we look at the Midwest economic structure, I think there are a couple of things that we can highlight. One is we have significant interdependence in terms of the internal markets, that's the interstate trade. We will see that we share enormous dependence in our international markets with a concentration on Canada and Mexico. We notice that we have very similar structural problems. In particular, as we focus on one of those structural problems, labor force, we have enormous issues of net out-migration, particularly of highly endowed human capital. We train a lot of very highly skilled people in the Midwest, but many of them leave. And at the same time, over the last 2 or 3 decades, we've had a significant underinvestment in high-skilled, blue-collar human capital. We have not trained enough people to staff the needs that we find in our manufacturing economies. And finally, I think we failed to exploit these economic interdependencies and got out of this mode of thinking of those state borders as somehow analogous to country borders and not thought about them as opportunities for us to think much more collaboratively and much more regional. So how has this economy changed? It's changed in a very, very dramatic way. Each state we refer to as hollowing out. What this means is that the average firm is now less dependent on sources of inputs and markets within the state. And it is much more dependent upon inputs that come from outside the region and on markets that are located outside the region. We have found that the value chains associated with the production of commodities are now increasing in length. We have greater specialization, and that is coming about as a result of a process called fragmentation. And at the bottom of the slide there, you can see that increasingly we're seeing production as being compartmentalized into very specialized units which are concentrated in one establishment in one state, then moved to another state where further additions are made to a third state, and so on and so forth. it is commented on several occasions that the average automobile component often moves across 2 or 3 states before it ends up in an automobile. And this reflects the fact that we are now competing to try to attract those production blocks, but we are very dependent on the production blocks behind us in the value chain and ahead of us. And that's where we get this complementarity and competition interaction that I mentioned in an earlier slide. So for us, looking at the analysis in analytical terms, this table looks at the volume of trade in the industrial Midwest. And you can see there are a number of characteristics of it that are very important. First, domestic trade accounts for somewhere between 83 and 91% of total trade. Yes, international trade is important, but it is dwarfed in magnitude by domestic trade. Secondly, that domestic trade among those Midwest states is very highly dependent upon trade with our neighbors. If those 5 states were countries, the trade between them would amount in 2007 to about $450 billion. It would make it the 7th largest trading area in the world. So this is an economic opportunity that we don't think about. We have not exploited it because we always think of ourselves as competitors one with another rather than as incredibly complementary in terms of our trading relationships. And then when we look at our international trade, we see that it is very highly dependent upon NAFTA, Canada, and Mexico. And in some cases, this dependence is as high as 64 or 65%. In the case of Wisconsin, it is much lower. But it's still an incredible dominance of production, both domestically to our neighboring states and internationally to Canada and to Mexico. As a result of this, when we look at changes that take place in one state, we find that on average, the degree of spillover effect of any change, both positive and negative, is very highly concentrated. And you can see from this table that somewhere between 20 and 30% of the spillover effects from change in one state are concentrated on the other 4 Midwestern states. And this is a very, very strong degree of dependence. And so when we look at it in terms of the effects of the recession, job changes and job losses in one state have had a very profound spillover effect on job losses in other states in the Midwest. So one of the other aspects of this is we not only have a significant degree of trade in terms of goods and services, but we also have enormous impacts as a result of trade in people, particularly in migration. And we have been analyzing this through access to annual data from the IRS. And one of the things that we have discovered is that our Midwest states are losing enormous amounts of income as a result of net migration. And I put here at the bottom, Illinois loses between $1 and $1.5 billion per year through net out migration. To put this in perspective, if that money had been spent in Illinois, it would have generated somewhere between 20 and 25,000 jobs. In a good year, Illinois adds somewhere between 50 and 55,000 jobs. So essentially, net migration you can think of as robbing us of somewhere between 20 and 30% of an annual year's job growth. And this graph summarizes, and you can see that the states of Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio are significant losers in terms of net migration, both in terms of foreign, but equally important in terms of the volume of flows in terms of net migration within in the U.S. When we look at what has been happening to this region, and now I'm looking at the more extensive region, you'll notice that with very few exceptions, we tend to underperform the U.S. as a whole. And we benchmark the U.S. as a whole with the green line, and you can see with the exception of Minnesota, all of these states either performed at or below the level of the U.S. over the period 1992 to 2007. And sadly, unless things change, the forecast suggests that our underperformance will be even more dramatic as we look ahead between 2007 in 2040. And the same thing is true for total output, the number of employed people, looking at total jobs, and looking at personal income. And to give you one example, Illinois used to be somewhere between 4th and 6th in terms of per capita income. In the last 15 years, it has now dropped to 15th. So the combination of the loss of manufacturing jobs and the net out migration is generating a dynamic that is really reducing the competitive positions of a lot of these Midwestern states. Well, what are the challenges that we are exploring right now? One of the things is to try to see the degree to which our occupational capital, our skill sets that we have within these regions are matching with industry needs, not only today, but over the next 10 to 30 years. Are we making enough human capital investment across states and in people? And I think this is particularly a key issue as fiscal resources are being challenged state after state. There has been a tendency to withdraw funding for education, particularly higher education. And the question that we might raise then is the degree to which this short-run issue might have very important and very negative long-run implications. Are we really addressing the fact that over the period between now and 2030, 20% of our population is going to be over 65? Have we addressed the role of aging? Do we have a labor force which is going to provide both the quantity and quality of skills that we are going to require? Have we looked at the role of interstate trade? Have we looked at this in a way that we can think of it strategically and build upon it? Have we tried to exploit and understand and interpret the nature and strength of these interstate value chains in a way that we can begin to ensure that they grow, that they are sustained, and that they continue to contribute to the economic welfare of our region? And to give you an idea of the magnitude of some of these, we looked at an example of the interstate impacts of what would happen if the Ford company closed its plant in Chicago. And what you've got here are the direct and indirect effects as you look upon it in total. But the next one really highlights the nature of this Midwest spatial chain, that 60% of the indirect effects are concentrated in those Midwest states, and only 40% would go to the rest of the country. And the next few slides provide an illustration of a similar type of process in terms of the value chain for the primary metals industry. But in fairness, I want to point out there are some sectors for which the value chain is very heavily concentrated still within individual states, and that's true for something like logistics and warehousing. So what we have found as a result of this strength is that in good times it has been really attractive and has really helped us build an enormous degree of competitiveness vis-a-vis the rest of the U.S. and the country. But during the current recession, we have had an enormous problem. 20% of the U.S. job losses have been concentrated in our Midwest states. And I think that as a negative thing on the one hand, but I think it also tells us how much this region acts as an economic youth. And the sad thing is that many of our governors, I think, fail to appreciate this. And we've seen some very nasty and negative advertising on the part of our surrounding neighbors who are attempting to raid Illinois businesses after the state enacted the tax increase. And this is very short run because essentially what it fails to understand is we are so closely integrated with each other that it's a zero-sum game to raid something from one state into another state. So the general picture we have from this analysis then is that we are a very highly interdependent state. We have not exploited it. And I think as a result of that, we are missing enormous opportunities to build the sort of economic coalition necessary to ensure the region's economic competitiveness over the next 20 years. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to our moderator, and who will introduce Graham Todd.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hewins, on a great presentation, and I'm sure that many of us on the call here have some questions as a follow-up to your presentation, which we will take, and Laura will help moderate after we finish up our last presentation. Our next presenter, Dr. Graham Toth, is the principal researcher and author of a report entitled In Search of Growth, published in partnership with CSG Midwest. Graham is the founder and president of Growth Economics, a consulting firm based in Sarasota, Florida, which focuses on job and economic growth in the global economy. In addition to his recent consulting work, Graham also has 20 years' experience preparing state benchmark and competitiveness assessments, including the competitiveness scorecards for several Midwestern state chambers of commerce. His ties to the Midwest include service as president of the Indiana Economic Development Council, a position he held for 13 years from 1989 to 2002. I am pleased to present Dr. Graham Toth, who will share with us some of his insights and conclusions from his most recent research on the economic conditions and performance of Midwestern states. Dr. Toth?
Thanks, Heath, and greetings all. I'm going to try to cover my comments in about 10 minutes, and I may have to skip fast a few slides, but I think that I should be able to get through the basic propositions enough for us then to have a good discussion in the last 10 minutes. This work, this PowerPoint is really an update of a presentation I made to CSG Midwest in about 2007, where I introduced the idea of a growth zone for the Midwest. I'm not wed to this idea or this wording, but it kind of captures the kind of perspective that I think we need coming out of Jeff's work, the way of thinking about the Midwest as an integrated economy, and then how to present that and package it, but also to collaborate strategically to promote it very, very quickly if we're serious about repositioning for growth in the Midwest. Laura, I can't seem to move along here for some reason or other. You there, Laura?
Yep.
There we go. I'm going to very briefly go back over the In Search of Growth report, then where the Midwest opportunities, examples of what I regard as economic zones, and then some 4 areas of key collaboration. Well, you might have to move me on, Laura, somehow. The In Search of Growth report, for those who are not familiar with it, is available on the website of CSG Midwest. And hopefully we'll update this every year. It's essentially a dashboard that gives the status of each state and also comparison of all the various report cards that are presented on each state for 2008-2009. Next one. Just to recap where we are right now, we look at 12 states, 2 in addition to the ones Jeff was talking about, the 2 Dakotas are included. And just to give perspective, the economic growth index we use shows quite variation across the states. So we have to realize going into this discussion that there's a lot of difference. There's a lot of difference in paces of growth and so forth. What we're looking at is where are the areas of commonality. Clearly, Jeff has indicated the most significant areas as very deep inter-firm relationships and connectivity across the Midwest. Next, please. Thank you. Just a few comments about what this report identifies from a regional point of view. The Midwest states that we've just talked about, performance has been subpar, but the governmental performance has been quite adequate, in fact, above average. Education has improved significantly. The workforce, not so much, but certainly there's some exceptional education reports now, or performance of several Midwest states. But it seems that this good education doesn't necessarily result in a high-performing workforce. Neither is the business climate, even though the business climate is considerably above average in most of these states, is not leading to the kind of growth that we would have expected from those kind of scores. On the next slide, we identify 3 areas where we have common vulnerabilities. So given the fact there's a great diversity of growth, but given the fact there's great interdependencies, where are some areas where there is most common deficiencies across the states? There's 3 main areas: technology competitiveness, entrepreneurial dynamism, and international business activity. And all of these, of course, are closely related to the talent base of the workforce. And here's the puzzle, that these very areas of underperformance are, in fact, areas of Midwest strength. The asset base we have in these areas is quite remarkable. If you just think about the kind of companies and the embedded expertise and knowledge we have in the industrial technology area, for example, in the Midwest, is quite phenomenal. Or if you take the capabilities of the Big Ten universities and associated research universities and so forth. So there's some kind of disconnect here. The other interesting thing about these 3 categories is, to my way of thinking, and here's my proposition, these are the very areas that are easiest for us to collaborate in. That yes, we might want to disagree on tax policy or regulatory policy or maybe even human capital and workforce development, but these are 3 areas that very closely relate to the interconnectedness Jeff is talking about, and they are areas where we could probably collaborate much more so than in the past. Next, please. I'm going to leave that. Jeff's spoken enough about the Midwest urgency of the situation. The opportunities for the Midwest are to keep doing better, faster, cheaper, and greener, what we already do, agriculture, manufacturing, distribution, to leverage off a very strong R&D and innovation base, to play much more significantly in this golden age of global economic expansion. Jeff points out that our international trade is pretty much focused to the Americas, so there's opportunities here. Next slide, please. To reconnect to the physical environment, and clearly there's been a lot of discussion about how to capitalize on our water asset and to improve smart land development, such as the initiatives in Ohio and so forth, clean environment, transportation, logistics. These are all areas we've been working on in various aspects of MLC and, of course, other interstate collaborations. But somehow we need to find better ways, both between the states and the provinces, to collaborate, as I say, in these 3 areas of technology competitiveness, entrepreneurship, and international trade. Next one, please. So how do other regions in the world deal with this situation? Well, I'm just teasing you with a kind of framework here. It's the economic zone framework, or whatever language you want to use. But basically, corporate decisions regarding investment, whether they're corporations in an area or corporations thinking of moving to an area, occur in 2 stages. They choose a country, state, or mega region, and then they investigate specific sites within that general area. And in this day and age, these decisions need abundance of information, very well presentation of the image and of the area, and all provided at speed and professionally well done. There are several variations on this theme. Singapore is just a classic example of an enterprise zone strategy that's been in existence for nearly 40 years. Ireland, more recently, I put a note there. It's not so much their growth strategy that's been in question, but their fiscal strategy that's got them into trouble. The special enterprise zones that started in China in the 80s have blossomed not only in China, but in many other countries now, not just in the less developed countries, but now being tried elsewhere. And, of course, closer to home, we have a variant of this in the urban enterprise zone kind of approach. So what I'm saying is, how could we take some of these kind of basic ideas of enterprise zones, or rather economic zones, and craft a new concept, a Midwest growth zone? And there's 4 areas I'd like to throw out. First, a refocus. Yes, we need to focus on many of the issues that we're dealing with, collaboratively in the Midwest. Water is an excellent example where great progress has been made on the Great Lakes environment and so forth. But the three areas, again, that I think we need to prioritize our focus is technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, especially second, third stage company growth, where, of course, the Edward Lowe Foundation in Michigan is a shining light, and so we have resources within the Midwest that understands these particular categories of growth companies. And, of course, trade is so critical to the way we move forward as a nation, particularly the Midwest region. Next. We also, as a second strategy, would think about rebranding the Midwest. Okay, I'm just making a suggestion here. Let's call it the cool frontier. Why cool? Well, it's a cool climate. It's not too hot, not too cold, and it may even benefit from global warming if that does occur. The cool lifestyles, both the mix of traditional and trendy lifestyles. Really cool research going on in the Midwest in both the traditional industrial areas as well as the information technology and biotech areas. And, of course, the really interesting stuff that goes on in the Midwest of switching from 20th century mass production to 21st century customized production, and how that's affecting existing industries as well as newly forming industries. Thirdly, we need some kind of structure. I call it the Cool Frontier Growth Alliance. I'm not suggesting some kind of large bureaucracy. Maybe it has a very small core staff and accomplishes its work mainly through joint ventures of finding 2, 3, 4 states, provinces that are very focused on a particular aspect of technology, entrepreneurship, or trade, and really driving hard on this. And hopefully by beginning in this way, other states and provinces would join as the topics and issues come to the fore. And finally, on the next one, if we can't do any of these things, the most important thing we need to think about moving forward and fairly fast is improving our research capabilities, our understanding of what this greater, this meta region is all about. Legislators particularly are anxious for near-term, real-time information. That's why we found that the report we did last year was so well received. Tracking progress, monitoring trends, making sure that people are well up to date with what's happening not only within the Midwest, but then what's happening in our competitor regions, so that we can be far more strategic in terms of how we move forward into a much more competitive position. So with that very quick summary, let me hand it back to you, Heath.
Thank you, Graham. I kind of want to start off before we kind of open up to, I think, question and answers for you as well as Dr. Ewing, which is, Dr. Ewing talked extensively in his presentation about the interconnectedness of the region from various components of jobs, job loss. Graham was able to go over, I think, a significant information and data regarding a lot of the common challenges that the Midwestern region faces in regards to key economic growth factors on innovation and technology and entrepreneurialism. My question to both of you to start us both off, and I'd prefer to hear both your answers, and I imagine those on the call would too, is why is it, or why would it be more beneficial for the Midwest region, and kind of tying up with both of what you ended with of collaboration? Why would it be beneficial for us as a region to collaborate on these challenges together instead of my state or any other state just going at it alone?
Well, this is Jeff Ewings here. My sense is that I think there's huge empirical data that talk about the gains from trade nationally when we look at U.S. entering into trade relationships with other countries. And I think what we're doing now is accumulating significant evidence that this also occurs intra-nationally. In other words, when states collaborate, when they interact. Having said that, I think that the strength of the interactions is much stronger within the country than it is between countries. And therefore, I think that this notion that somehow our fortunes can be determined without concern with what's happening with our trading partners is a misnomer. And I think that rather than fighting this, we need to embrace it. The second perspective I would share with you is that people outside this part of the world, particularly outside of this country, look upon the Midwest as a region. And they think of it in these terms. And it's sort of surprising that we don't. And so what I would like to do is sort of try to align the sort of international perspectives with what is going on inside the region so that we can exploit these advantages and not engage in what I regard as somewhat destructive behavior of assuming that we are competitors and that's it. Because I think that has really hurt us, and I think we have not achieved the sort of benefits that we could achieve by being much more proactive. Graham?
Yes, just adding to that, I mean, it's a great answer, Jeff. I would just add the fact that right now, with the way the global economy is situated and the U.S. economy coming out of a very severe recession, there are a lot of decisions being made as to where to invest next. And there is a lot of capital sitting idle, especially in the corporate sector. The Midwest needs to package itself and present itself in such a way that it is enthusiastic about its own future. Because the first, as I say, the first decision made by these investment efforts is to decide what area or state you want to be in. And the presentation of the Midwest as a partnership and as a opportunistic area is essential, because there are so many other areas and regions in the world that are presenting themselves as areas of opportunity. I'll leave it at that and open up to discussion.
So this is Greg Webb with ADM, Archer Daniels Midland Company, based in Illinois, but with operations throughout the Midwest. Who becomes the conduit, though, to pull together the region? You know, we have chief executives of each of the states in the forms of governors, and even as Dr. Hewings had mentioned, when Illinois decided to raise its rates of taxation, we had Indiana and Wisconsin and then states from other regions of the country, you know, saying that move there. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure, you know, it's nice to have competition amongst us, but who and how do you get a collaborative sense so that the Midwest recognizes itself as this region that has this interdependence and become more of a powerhouse than what we have heretofore?
I'll throw my 2 cents in, and like Graham had, I really despair that our politicians are going to be the ones to do this. And I think that the sort of behaviors that we have seen in the last several months have suggested that that's not likely to happen. I think the only thing will happen is some public policy interest groups. But more importantly, I think I hope that it's the private sector that comes forward, because I think it's in their best interest. Given the fact that companies like yours, companies like the automobile sector, are so heavily dependent in supply chains that are very heavily concentrated in this region, it would seem that the coordination that I'm talking about and that Graham is talking about is going to benefit you. And hopefully that you will be the people who step forward and say, look, enough of this nonsense. Let's try to operate as an economic unit and not try to raid each other's companies, but try to invest in some way that we can generate some significant spillovers that are positive for the whole region.
This is Graham. I would just, I think you're raising the most important point, is how it would work, who would be the lead. It appears from, as you study these various phenomena around the world, they all structure in different ways, and they're all driven by different kinds of cultures and circumstances that cause them to happen. All I'm proposing is it's time for us to see what will work. I'm thinking what would work best is not to be some large, if you like, elaborate structure, because we don't like that in the Midwest, but rather find some kind of, it would have to be a public-private partnership. It would have to have people like yourself, ADM and other companies that are, as Jeff says, vested in the future of the Midwest, making themselves heard about working on some particular areas that will make us more competitive. We do have some models in the U.S. The Southern Growth Policies Board is one way that we know worked in the South. It's over 20 years old. I don't think that's quite the structure that might work for us, but it gives us some ideas as to how different states or partnerships are formed in a region to reposition that area. And I'll turn it back.
I don't see anybody with their little virtual hand raised. Was there anybody else wanted to comment or address the question that Greg Webb had asked about who becomes the conduit, or anything to add on that?
Well, this is this is Todd Zoller from Columbus, Ohio, with a products development company. And, I look over this as how we present it, that first key message, like Midwest is the best, or how we have that, and then each state have that goal set up as far as categories of what they're best at, and then create that one conduit essentially where each state states what they're good at, like Ohio will be polymers. So, that would be our drive. But who would say which is best? I don't know. Mm-hmm. But if you just map over those states, like you're looking down over the United States, and you look at the states that are involved, you kind of just branch that off, and it kind of helps us organize.
That's a good suggestion. I think the industrial strengths vary across the Midwest. These companies are networked tightly across various states, but there are these areas of technology expertise. You can think of the medical prosthetics industry that's basically concentrated in Warsaw, Indiana, and so you could go through and map this out. And states try to do this. It's just they're doing it individually, and we have to present this map, as you're saying, in a much more creative and comprehensive way to grab people's attention about what is going on and what we have to offer.
It's also distributorship ability to the rest of the world, too, which is who we want to sell to. So that area, definitely needs to be accentuated. But again, I'm listening to what's going on here. But this seems to be, it's all about how we present ourselves, just like a restaurant. Everybody wants to be next to the good guy. So everybody should be proud of everybody and work towards that one goal. So anyways, go ahead.
And we have a question from Ann Grinland with the Midwestern Higher Education Compact.
Yes, this is Ann. We're running short of time, but I just thought it would be interesting if we saw more of the published statistics showing the regional impact. We're used to seeing, for instance, out-migration data on how a state will lose to neighboring states, for instance. But it would be interesting to know how, like your slide showed, how as a region we're all losing as a region, to see those side-by-side comparisons.
Sure. Thank you for the suggestion. Yeah, we can do that very easily.
And Vicki?
Yes, Vicki Markison. I'm with the Seven Rivers Regional Alliance, and we actually are a kind of a tri-state regional group, but on a much more micro level. We have 6 counties in Wisconsin, 2 in Minnesota, and 2 in Iowa. My suggestion is that one major hurdle that we encounter, and it happens at all of the levels, is it's all about tax base. And with the budgets being what they are, the movement of tax base from one area to another is what creates that fundamental competition. And for any of the states at that level to come together, there almost needs to be some sort of model for what to do about a tax base, and to say if a company stays within the Midwest, it's still a win, but how can we somehow make sure that the tax base shift isn't detrimental to another state or another, in our case, a microregion, because that's fundamentally what creates this competition. Is everybody's budgets look horrendous, and any shift in tax base for the positive is a win, and to the negative is detrimental. Has anybody seen any interesting models, if you will, for getting over that tax base hurdle?
This is Jeff Hewings. You raised an interesting question, but the problem is that when states start throwing money to attract the firm, nobody does the accounting and says, what is the benefit cost analysis? Is it really truly going to be a win? And we looked at this many years ago in the context of all the fiscal wars over attracting automobile plants. And the amount of money per job created was just enormous. And the amortization schedule was at least 40 years before it would be paid back. The second one, and I think is even more important, is that it's in our best interest to understand that the preservation of a company in a healthy state in one state is probably going to help our tax base because of the supply chain issue. And that's the dynamic which goes unappreciated, because we only focus on individual plants, but we don't understand that sort of below the surface there is this underground network which is generating revenue throughout the Midwest. And so disturbing that is not in our best interest. And furthermore, that I think we really need to understand that if this is demonstrated, it should not be poo-pooed as sort of academic contrivances, but in fact it is a reality. And I think all too often people only see, if you like, the top of the iceberg, and they don't understand a lot of the activity is below. And a good example of that is our supply chain in terms of feeding Ford is twice as large, the Ford plants outside the state, than it is in the state. So it's in Illinois' best interest to make sure that the Ford company becomes nationally and internationally competitive, because that's going to help generate revenue for Illinois, even though those assembly plants are located outside our state borders.
And if I can just make a quick follow-up comment then based on what you said and what I've heard is, obviously you have to build that trust. And it seems like the easiest first step to building that trust is going after markets that we're not necessarily competing on, particularly trying to attract international business to the companies that we already have. So if you're looking for feedback, to me the logical first step would be to unite the states to say, how do we start capturing a greater international market?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this is Graham, it seems to me that that's where we can collaborate much more comfortably than in areas where we have traditionally been competitive, is to pick those particular categories that are less threatening, as it were. And certainly the international trade, everybody gets the message that it's so important. And the region really does have quite some strength in that area, and good international financing capabilities, and lots of large companies that do this, so they can certainly be a resource to mid-sized and small companies and so forth. By the way, I do like your idea about tax-based sharing of some form between states. As you know from your experience in your region, it's hard enough to negotiate any kind of tax-based sharing across units of government, but to get to the state level is an interesting kind of...
Well, and I have seen the initial signs or initial work towards that, and it's just a simple agreement that if a business contacts you about moving to your area, that there is just a simple agreement that you notify the area that they are moving from. Now, that works within a micro-region, but it may not work within a state, between states. But those are some early formations of trust as well.
Yes. Jeff mentioned that he doesn't like the idea of the governor of Indiana stealing companies from Illinois. But frankly, if Illinois cannot get its business climate factors together in a fairly short space of time, then it will be important for those companies to know they have another home somewhere in the Midwest so as to retain the density of these networks, these interconnected relationships that he's talking about. We don't want to lose that.
I don't think we have any other questions pending. I do know there was a kind of procedural question on the availability of the slides, and the answer is yes. We're going to make the slides. All of the PowerPoints will be available on our website, and hopefully by the end of the week we'll also have the this whole recording available on the website. So you can go back to it or you can share it with somebody. Folks who missed it might be able to check that out, so we have a record as we build on this. I'm going to ask Graham and Jeff if they want to make one concluding comment before we wrap things up. So Graham, Jeff?
I just want to say thank you very much for participating, and as always, we would be delighted to receive further feedback, and if something occurs to you in the next several weeks or months, be sure to let us know.
Thank you, Jeff.
I just want to come back to Greg's comments. It is hard to conceive how we do form a more perfect collaboration, as it were, but it is extremely important that we do it in some form or other, in some areas, some categories of development. And so let's just keep exploring different ways this can occur. We do have the support of the chair of MLC Midwest right now, who's very committed to this, Scott Reschke. So let's see if we can nurture these ideas as we go through these webinar series.
Thank you. And we hope you all will continue to join us through this series. And you'll be receiving notices shortly about the dates for the future ones. And we welcome you to all those conversations. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.